We are holding on 59B2. Okay, we're holding on 59B2. Test at the Mishnah. Oh, we're getting an echo. Are we getting an echo?
No, I'm fine.
Now I'm getting rid of this.
Right, hold on. Jerry's phone was giving things. Very good. Okay, so now, here's the rules. We're actually going into Masechta Zvachim today. Masechta Zvachim starts off with the idea of bringing a carbon shaloi lishmon, not for its own sake, not for its own name. So in other words, you're bringing a Pesach, you assign a carbon, you said it's going to be a Pesach, and then when you bring it as a shlomo. Just use that as an example. When we say bring it, there are four avodas that equal one. Shchita, which is the sacrifice. There is Kabbalah Sadam, accepting the blood. Halicha, carrying the blood from the place where you shechted in the north or wherever it was in the Hazara in the courtyard, all the way to the altar, to the Mizbeach, and then there's Zerika Sadam onto the four corners of the altar. If at any point along the way, in the basic case, you happen to have a thought, a machshava, and apparently there's an argument whether the machshava has to be by mouth or even just by thinking, and we're going to go with just by thinking. Even if you have a machshava in your head, a thought in your head, not for the sake of the actual carbon that you brought, for something else, that's what this is all talking about. Now, if you're not confused now, you will be confused in a couple of minutes. Okay? And it is what it is. We're going to take this Gemara one line at a time, and we'll try to hold cheshbon. Because the bigger problem is, what happens if you start off saying it correctly, and in the middle you switch? So you say, I had to bring a chatas. So you start off by saying, I'm slaughtering it for a chatas. And then you go ahead and you say, oh, by the way, I'm gathering in the blood for the sake of a shlomim. Which word counts? The first words or the second words? What happens within one of the avodas? While you pick up the knife to slaughter, you say, this is going to be for the chatas. When you do the actual slaughtering, you say it's going to be for a shlomim. Does it matter? Does it matter? This is this Gemara. All right? So
machlokes between Rab Meir and Rab Yosi.
Well, Daddy, you're giving away the story. We're not up to that yet, right? First we give the introduction. Then we'll see where we get to that machlokes. Here we go. If one slaughters a Pesach not for its own sake, that means he goes ahead and he put aside this animal to be a Pesach, and at the time he got a brain freeze, and he decided to bring it for the Shem Shlomo, for a Shalom. Okay? Or Vikibo Vaholach V'Zorak Shalai Lishman 59b3. Or he received, it means he received the blood, he moved the blood, he carried the blood to the altar, or he threw the blood Zerika. So that's Kabbalah, Halicha, and Zerika, and any one of them not for its own sake. So in other words, if at any one of the 4 points of the Avodah, he has a thought for something else, not for basically for the Shlamim, or if he began for its own sake, for the sake of the Pesach, and then he continued not for its own sake, not for the case of the Pesach, but for a Shlamim. So that seems to be even within one Avodah. So he began to accept the blood for the Shem Pesach. But at the end of the day, he finished collecting the blood for the Shem of the Shlamim. Or just the opposite, he started off the wrong way. He started off doing it for the Shem Shlamim, and then he said, oops, I remember it's a Pesach, I'm now going to do it for a Pesach. Puzzle, it's puzzle. The word puzzle means it's no good, invalid completely. It cannot be brought up. It cannot help. That is because other korbanos, and not talking about a Pesach, but a regular shlomim, if it's brought for the wrong thing, but at least the shechita was done correctly, it could
Kosher.
continue to bring it up onto the altar. It won't be good for the balabas, for the owner, to get atonement. You won't get atonement, but you could continue to at least bring the carbon all the way through to the end. Not the case of Pesach. Okay, keep that in mind. That's why the word here is puzzle as opposed to not kosher or something like that. I mean, any mechuper, it's not, it doesn't achieve atonement, but it could be brought. Not in this case. Now the Gemara gives example. The Mishnah gives example. What's an example of its own sake and not for its own sake? L'shem Pesach or l'shem Shalomim. It began as the sake of a Pesach, and you ended it, you got a brain freeze, and you continued it for the sake of Shalomim. Thank you. Shaloi l'shmoi u'l'shmoi, or just the opposite. You started off and did it as a Shalomim, and then you said, oops, I remember, it's a Pesach. L'shem Shalomim u'l'shem Pesach. Right? That's exactly what it is. Shaloi l'shmoi l'shmoi l'shem Shalomim u'l'shem Pesach. Good morning, Charlie. How are you? Okay, so.
Morning.
Bayi, we're up to the Gemara, 59b, through the bottom. Bayi Rapoko. Avoida achas tenan or shnei avoidas tenan? Are we talking about that within one avoida? Let's pick the avoida of halicha, okay, of carrying the blood. Remember, there are four avoidas: shchita, the slaughtering; Kabbalah Saddam, capturing, receiving the blood; conveying halicha, conveying the blood from the place where you shechted it to the altar, and sprinkling on the altar zerika. So let's pick one. In halicha, I started halicha with the right intentions for a Pesach. I continued the halicha with the shlomim. So that means within one avodah, I had two different thoughts. That's the first one. Avodah achas tanan or shtei avodas tanan. We're talking about two intentions within two avodas. So in other words, I shechted it, I sacrificed it l'shem Pesach, but I received the blood to l'shem shlomim. So there's an afkamina. If my two machshavas happen within one avodah, or they each two different thoughts, each avodah itself. One avodah I did correctly, l'shem Pesachim, l'shem Pesach. The next avodah, halich, kabbalah or halicha, I did something else. What do we care? So Zok the Gemara. Ba'avodah achas tanan, did the Mishnah teach us in one avodah? That means within one avodah, let's say one halicha, carrying the blood, I had two different thoughts, one for a Pesach and one for a Shlomim, the Rabbi Yossi. And we're banging into Rabbi Yossi. We had this Gemara about 10 dafim ago. The Oma af gemar devorov odom nisbas. Even the last words of a person are accountable. In other words, everybody agrees. The first words that come out of a person's mouth are accountable, are stamped. The question is if the second words that come out of his mouth that seem to contradict the first word, Toifus Lashon Achron work as well. There's Toifus Lashon Rishon and Toifus Lashon Basur, the second words. Everybody agrees Toifus Lashon Rishon, the first words count. The question is, do the second words as well, if they contradict the first words, are they still valid? Rabbi Yossi holds second words are as valid as well. Af gemar devorav, even the end of words, odom nisbas, the last words are accountable. So and in that case, we now have a case of two intentions expressed in one avodah. So he began the avodah correctly by saying it's for a Pesach. Then he had a machshava, a thought it should be for a shlomim. If I say that only the first lashon rishon typhus, the first word is typhus, but the second words, if they contradict, are not, so then it's only for a Pesach and it would be good. But if I go ahead and say that all the words matter, then if I have a contradiction, it's no good. So Rabbi Yossi, the Omar Apgemar Devar of Adam Nispas, even a person is held accountable for all his words, beginning and end. The Rameya, because if it was according to Rameya, Hat Oimet Toifus Loshen Rishon, that legally speaking, only the first words that come out of his mouth are the real words. We're now on Samach Hamid Aleph, 64, right? So in that case, if we wanted to say our Mishnah, which says Pasul cannot be Rameir, since Rameir holds Toifus Loshen Rishon. But the second words, if they contradict, don't count. It's as if he didn't say it. In this case, therefore, if he says the words, he starts off with a machshava of Pesach and then switches on to a machshava of Shlomim. We would ignore the machshava of Shlomim and stick to only Pesach, and it therefore would be good. Since our Mishnah says only Pasul, says it's Pasul if I have two machshavos, Al Kachach, we're forced to say it's going according to Rabbi Yossi, who says we look at all his words, and since the second part of his words, since the second part of his machshava, I'm using words, but the second part of his machshava, of his thought process, contradicted the thought process of his first words, therefore it's no good, it's possible. Or do we say, we're dealing with two different avodas. We're dealing with, let's say, the Kabbalah Saddam receiving the blood, and then afterwards the Halicha Saddam conveying the dam to the blood to the Mizbeach. So let's say he went ahead and one machshava when he received the dam. When they received the dam, it was for the Pesach. When he did the Halicha, which is a completely different avodah, it was for the Shlomim. So do we say in that case, even according to Rameya that says we only concentrate on his first thoughts, his first words, even there, Hani Mili Bavoida Achas, that's where it's in one
one avoider.
in one action, because in one action. So if it all took place during Kabbalah, during the receiving of the blood, where he began receiving it with the right intention for a Pesach, and he ended up with the wrong intention for a Shlomim, will ignore the second intention. But by two avoiders, he will say, of course it's no good, because he will say every avoider, whether Shechita, Kabbalah, Halicha, or Zerika, all four
It's by itself.
inclusive. Each one stands on its own. So therefore, Toifus Lashon Rishon, he did the Shechita correctly for the thought of a Pesach, but he did the Kabbalah for the thought of a Shlomim. It doesn't matter. He did one. That's Toifus Lashon Rishon regarding the Shlom, regarding Kabbalah. So therefore, the machlokes is, if I say we're dealing with one avodah and two thoughts, the Mishnah is definitely Rabbi Yossi and not Rameya. If it's one thought, two different avodas, then it
could be Rameya.
Exactly. Then it could even be Rameya. So to Gemara. And most of our today is going to be exactly this. Are we dealing with one avodah or two avodas? That's it. Once you got that clear in your head, the Gemara pretty much goes straight. Ami ahoy. Okay, let's take a look. If we're saying, we're talking about where first he had the wrong intention and then he had the right intention. He was meant to bring this for a Pesach, and instead he first thought he was bringing it for a Shlomim, and then he switched in his brain and said, oops, it's for a Pesach. In that case, it doesn't matter whether these two thoughts happen in one avodah or each of them happen in two avodas. The Pesach will be no good from the first attempt. The whole Rabbi Yossi Nami, because even according to Rabbi Yossi, who says Afkamar Devar of Adam Nitfas Islay, that we take into account all the words, even the second words and the first words, right? And even there will be no good. Why? Since my first thought was for the wrong intention, according to Rameir, it's definitely no good, because he says Toifus Lashon Rishon. the first words out of your mouth are the ones that count. The ones that came out of my mouth were for the wrong carbon. It was machshava for the wrong carbon. But even according to Rabbi Yosef, that says we look at the whole entirety, and you
It's
see that
also
my
possible.
words came to correct my first words. It doesn't matter. I got to look at the totality, and if there's a contradiction within my totality, it's no good. So Elamai, what are we really talking about? Elalishmai ushalai lishmai, where he starts off with the correct. He starts off with the correct intention, and then it switches to the incorrect intention, into the wrong intention. So now, if we're dealing with one avodah, it can only be according to Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi says what he could because according to Rabbi Meir, Toifus Lashon Rishon in one avodah,
It will be kosher.
I started with the right attention. The fact that 2 seconds later I switched to the wrong attention is meaningless.
Doesn't count.
First word's only the only one that counts. Masha ain't according to Rabbi Yossi, who says you got to look at the totality, even in one case, even if it all happened in one avodah, it wouldn't matter. It would be no good. It would be no good. What's the din? What are we talking about? So now that the Gemara explained it clearly, we now have to try to understand our Mishnah. If we want to understand who's the author of our Mishnah, whether it's Rabbi Yossi or it could even be Rabbi Meir, it's tied to, are we talking about where the two thoughts happen within one avodah,
One avodah or the two avodas?
within two avodas, and then it could even be Rabbi Meir who holds Toifus Lashon Rishon, because each one will be mutually exclusive. Tashma. HaPesach sheshachet shaloi l'shma. If one slaughtered the Pesach not for its own sake, you say for the sake of a shlomim, v'kiba v'hilach v'zirek shaloi l'shma, and he did the whole other things. He was mekabel the dam, he carried the dam, and he sprinkled the dam, and he was zayik the dam, all shaloi l'shma, not for its sake. Right? What's the case? Hey chidami. If you want to teach it like the Mishnah teaches it, that the Kohen performed all four avodas with the wrong thought processing, then why do I need to say until he did all four with the proper intentions? As long as he started off with the wrong intention, it's already no good. If all I have to say is, if you did the shechita, if I slaughtered it, if I sacrificed it with the wrong intention, automatically, even if I did everything correct, after that, it's already no good. Kol shekain, if I do all four, of course it's no good. So that can't be the case, right? Logically, you don't need that to teach me to the case. Elolav hochikama. The Mishnah must be talking about the following. HaPesach sheshochat shaloi l'shma. A Pesach that you slaughtered not for its sake, for the sake of a shlom. Inami sheshachtu l'shma. No, you do it correctly. You slaughter it for the sake of a Pesach. But the kibbutz v'hilach v'zarg shaloi l'shman. But the other avodas you do not for its sake, but the sake of a shlomim. V'zorak inami, or sheshachtu the kibbutz v'hilach l'shma. You do the shechita, the receiving of the blood and the carrying of the blood. You do all correctly. Okay, you do it all correctly for the sake of a Pesach. But the zorak shaloi l'shma. But I throw it not for its own sake. I throw it for its own sake, right? The habile shtei avodas. So therefore, what do you see? It's two different avodas. In other words, I did three of the avodas for its own sake, for the sake of the Pesach. The fourth one, the zerika, the spritzing, the sprinkling, I did not for its own sake. What do you see here? That has to be the case of the Mishnah. If that's the case of the Mishnah, we're talking about two avodas. Then the Mishnah could even be Rabbi Meir, because even though Rabbi Meir holds Toifus Lashon Rishon, that only the first thought, the first words are the ones that count. But since each avodah is mutually exclusive, if I do one of the avodas with the wrong thought, it blows it. It's papuch. You blow it. So now it looks like it could be either Rabbi Yossi or even Rabbi Meir. So says the Gemara, Ema Seifa. Good. So far we're in a good shape. Ema Seifa. Now let's look at the Seifa. L'shmai u'shaloi l'shmai. For its own sake and its not own sake. Hey Chidami, what's the case? If you want to say, if you want to continue and say it's also dealing by two avodas, let's say by Kabbalah and Alicha, or from whatever it is, Hainu ratio. But if that's the case, you're just repeating in the Sefer the exact same case that essentially you said in the ratio at the beginning of the Mishnah. Elo Malav, you gotta say, obviously the Mishnah is not a carbon copy. In the end, it's got to be Ba'avoida Achas. The seifa of the case of Shaloi L'Shmoi L'Shma has to be the case of one Avoida. Within one Avoida, I had two different thoughts. One that was not for its own sake, and then I said, oops, I'm doing it for the wrong thing. I want to do it for its own sake. And that means, therefore, that the Mishnah is going according to Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi is the one who says that with Toifus, everything that he says. Side the first word, side the first thought, and side the second thought. Even the second thought goes ahead, and if the two thoughts contradict each other, it passes. So therefore, we say al korchov, since the seifa is Rabbi Yosi, al korchov the ratio is Rabbi Yosi. Okay, because the seifa definitely cannot be Rameir, because Rameir will tell you Toifus Lashon Rishon. Right? But Rabbi Yosi is when you look at the totality, and the totality is a contradiction. That's why it's possible. Says the Gemara, right? Both half of the Mishnahs know I can learn of both half of the Mishnahs. Good morning, Jeff.
Sorry to be late.
No, don't worry about it. We're talking about where the thought processes took place over two avodas. Again, there are four actions when it comes to a sacrifice. There is the slaughtering, shchita. There is the kabbalah, receiving the blood. There's the halicha, conveying the blood to the altar. And there is zerika, sprinkling the blood onto the altar, the corners of the altar. Each one of them is an avoida, is an action. Okay, is an action. So again, we're saying loy. 60A1 on the right hand side, the last paragraph. Loy. La'olam b'shtei avodas. Both the beginning of the Mishnah and the end of the Mishnah are talking about by two different avodas. So let us say it's talking about the receiving of the blood and carrying of the blood. What's the difference? The first case in the Mishnah, begins where he was standing to slaughter it, to begin the process, and he had an intention regarding the slaughtering. Inami koi bizarika, or no, he's standing by the last of the actions, by sprinkling the blood onto the altar. The sefer the koi b'shchito, he's talking about, inami koi b'zarika, he's talking about by the sprinkling, the kamachashe b'zarika, and the thought processing that we're dealing with, whether l'shma, shalai l'shma, is whether for its own sake or for the sake of a different sacrifice, is by the zarika. The sefer is flipped around. The koi b'shchito, the kashe b'zarika, where he's holding at the beginning by shchita. But his thought process is already to the end, to the sprinkling. So he's shechting it l'shem the Pesach. He's slaughtering it for its proper intention for the Passover sacrifice, for the Pesach sacrifice. But his mind, while he's doing this, his mind is already on the sprinkling. Says, by the way, I'm going to sprinkle it for a shalomim, for something else. The Omar that he says,
why would he do that?
I say he's a Chassidish fellow, and he says it l'shem yichud, right? I'm going to do it for the sake of the Passover slaughter. But I'm going to sprinkle it in order to throw its blood, not for its sake, but the sake of a shalom. So now you start up definitely with the correct. You got your thought process is about two avodas, but the thought process is all taking place within one avodah at the time of the slaughtering. It's about two avodas, but it takes place within one. One is a good one is a not a good one. Now already is it typhus lashon rishon, typhus lashon achron. It's only the first word counts, and therefore it's good, because at the end of the day, my first thought was to bring it for the right thing for a Pesach. Or no, does even the last words count, and then that's a contradiction, and therefore the whole thing is no good. So we're up to now.
Then it goes like both, Rameir and Rabbi Yosi.
So 60A2, Now we're up to 68 the Kamash Malon. The Mishnah is coming to tell us the machshivim le'avoida that in fact it does work. You could effectively intend from one avoida to another avoida. The fact that you're standing at the beginning, at the sacrifice, and your mind flies through to 4 steps down the line to the Zerika, yes, that's already an effect, and it passes Bahainu de Rav Papa, and this is exactly Rav Papa in Masechta Zevachim in Daf Yud Amid Aleph, where he's not sure whether if I have a machsheva zaris, an incorrect thought for down the line, not where I'm standing, whether it has an effect or not. And our Mishnah is coming to tell us, yes, it does. You should know that this is extremely problematic, guys, because we have a rule. Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitztaref l'maisa. Machshava ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitztaref l'maisa. If somebody wants to do an Aveiro, and he has a machshava to do an Aveiro, it's not considered an action. Only when you do the action did you break the rule. A thought process to break the rule is not. You hear? A thought process to break the rule. It's called, the lashon is machshava, an intent. Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitztaref l'maisa. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not connected to an action. By a mitzvah, however, just the thought of having a mitzvah. In other words, if you're lazy, but your thought is to come to the Daf Yomi, you already got a mitzvah. You don't get any smarter, but at least you get a mitzvah, because at least you had a good thought. For a mitzvah, yes, it's mitzvah l'maisa. For an aveira, it is not mitzvah l'maisa. What are we saying over here? That my thought process at shechita, at sacrifice, right, is good. But my thought flew down 4 steps in front, all the way to the sprinkling for a machshava zaris, for an incorrect and wrong intent of doing it for a shlomim. Why should it work? A thought that's no good. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzvah l'maisa. How do we consider it an action to passel a carbon? Truth is, I asked this question 7 1/3 years ago on the side of my Gemara. I still don't have an answer. As my father once told me when we used to try to learn together when I was a teenager, you don't die from a question. You got a question. Okay, now move on. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to move on.
And does it have anything, the fact that it's a Kohen?
No, you see, it doesn't matter. You see, it doesn't matter. You're right, because Kahanim's the reason. That's what we said yesterday. Right. So, but at the end of the day, it's a thought. You have to remember, that's why I keep saying, we're going according to the Svara of Rashi that is happening in his head. We're going according to the Rambam. The Rambam says this is all happening in his head. Rashi and Tosfos actually say that there are words coming out of his mouth. He's actually saying all this. But the simple lashon, I'm going with the Rambam's Svara here, that we're dealing with machshava zaris, with intent completely, which means it's not out there. It's not real. It's not bad.
But it doesn't apply by korbanos.
And it does, right, but why
In
not?
machshavas, in HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzvah machshava l'maisa is by shar mitzvahs.
Right.
But korban is intrinsically, because you're bringing the korban for something that you did, or for it's a Pesach. If you have a machshava of something else, then it's nothing. It's like if you're daven and you're thinking about the baseball game, then the tefillah is nothing.
Well,
so things that.
Daddy, that isn't 100% true, because the Gaba by Reb Levi Yitzchak Baditchev took Reb Levi Yitzchak Baditchev, the holy Kedushas Levi, outside, and he saw that the wagon driver was fixing his wheel, was changing his tire in Talis and Tefillin.
Right.
And so the Gabba said to the Rav, look, in middle of davening, he's changing the wheel. And the Rav said, no, in middle of changing the wheel, he's davening. Exactly. If you're a Litvak, you see it. If you're a Litvak, you see it. No davening, he's changing the thing. But we have a Hasidic heart. Don't you remember where we come from?
He was a good lawyer, but for Klal Yisrael. But when it comes to Karbonis, Machshavas is the Machshavah counts.
Kabbanis don't really make sense if you think about it. Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't need our kabbanis. He doesn't need our sacrifices. We're really breaking it for ourselves, including the Korban Pesach, which is the great thank you, and it's the great overturn of avodah zarah, of idolatry, because these were the idols of, just like in India, the cows. So the sheep were the idols of the Mitzrayim. And this is what it was. And it's true. So that, of course, is the bottom line. But on a pure, simple thing, especially where we're saying that each avodah is mutually exclusive, it's not so simple, this answer. Because if you're going to say mutually exclusive, just the thoughts, I have a thought about a mutually exclusive avodah, which didn't yet take place, not so simple not to say that it's mitzvah.
Right. But even when he gets to the Zrika, let's say, and he does, and then he did it lishmo.
It would be no good
because he didn't have. It's still no good because it's ready. It's too late.
Right. Yeah. So let's keep going. But it's an interesting question, no question about it. So now we still don't know whether we don't have clarity whether we're dealing with one avodah, one action with two thoughts, or two actions, each one with a different thought. Tashma. Let's go to the last case of the Mishnah. We're on 68.2, heading towards the bottom. Oy shaloi lishmoi ulishmoi posel. If he slaughtered it to Pesach for its own sake and not for its own sake, what are we talking about? It's no good. Hey, Chidam. If we're talking about two avodas, so in other words, he shechted it, he slaughtered it l'shem Pesach, and he was mekabel the dam, and he gathered and he received the blood for a shame of a shlomim. I don't need that. Hashta l'shmoy u'shaloi l'shmoy amrit pasol. Now that you've already said that an intention that's first for its own sake, and then not for its own sake. So you started off good, and then you ended up no good is no good. That if you start off with the wrong, you start up with the shame shlomim, and you only then switch around and do it for the right shake, for the shake of a Pesach, like kol shekain. Ella, what are we talking about? We're dealing with one act. Within one action, you had a shaloi l'shmai and l'shmai, not for its own sake and for its sake. Umi the seipa avodah achas, reishinami b'avodah achas. And if you're dealing with avodah achas, it can only be Rabbi Yosi. It can't be Rav Meir, because Rav Meir says you got to look what he. It could only right. It could only be Rabbi Yosi. It could only be Rav Meir. Actually, it can't be either one. It's going to be a problem. Why? You're dealing with two attempts and two avodas. You don't need it. It's simply an editing situation. To keep the Mishnah on an even keel, we just keep bringing both cases. Okay? But at the end of the case, the truth of the matter is, you're going to do what it called. The truth of the matter is, the Mishnah would see, according to the Chavamim, it would have been Rabbi Yosi, but the truth of the matter is, we have no clarity. So let's keep going. Yeah, Charlie, you have a question?
I have to leave. I'm sorry. I have to.
No
Something
problem.
came up. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks.
Be well.
See you later. Have a great day. So, Tashma, let's go try to learn it up. The next Mishnah. The next Mishnah goes like this. Shechatu shaloi la'achlon. If he slaughters it for those who are unable to eat it. Remember, a carbon Pesach, you could only bring on those people who can eat the Pesach. So one of them, if a person is an older person who unfortunately has no teeth, okay, or is sick, and can't make it. Okay? And you slaughter it even for those people, even though they're not going to be able to eat it. Or to those people who are not registered on the Pesach. Remember, we talked about this before. Before the next words. What it called? That those, before you shech the Pesach, you have to sign up for the Pesach. Similarly, like by February 2nd, you have to vote. You have to vote in Golden Grove's elections. Otherwise, you can't, you can't vote. So, or as Jerry just said, or those who are uncircumcised or are tamei, who therefore cannot be I'm so sorry, just hang on 1 second. So says the Gemara, puzzle. It's puzzle. So says the Gemara, hacha pshita b'avoda achas. We must be talking about within one avodah. That means he shechted it while he was slaughtering. He slaughtered it for those who are unable to eat from this Pesach. Why? And the reason for this is since only one intention was expressed in each case. Look how the way it was. The Mishnah clearly said, Shachtoi, he slaughtered not to eat on those who cannot eat, which means we're dealing with Shechita. Need the Sefer Ba'avoda Achas. If the next Mishnah is talking about by one act, Reishadabi Ba'avoda Achas.
It only applies by Shechita, that's why.
Right,
it only applies by Shechita.
That's right.
The Shalai Levlachlo and everything, only by Shechita.
Right. Now, we're not actually up to, because Gemara didn't learn it, but my father's bringing us to the point. The eating problem is always on the shechita, because you have to be registered on the animal before the shechita. Once it's structured, you can't register it. So everything is tied to the shechita. A person who cannot eat from the animal is considered not registered on the animal. So therefore, it works with the shechita. So the Gemara here says, my area, ha kediisa, hot kediisa. Each case is unique. Sefer avoda achas reisha, avoda achas ishtei avodas. So I still have no idea who the Tana of our Mishnah is, who's the author. Says the Gemara, Vaita, Toshma, give me a different case. La'achlo shaloi la'achlo. He slaughtered it for those who cannot eat it and for those who could eat it. So he slaughtered it for the guys who are registered, but he also slaughtered it for people who are not well, for people who are tomei, for an uncircumcised person, right? If we say b'shtei avodas, we're dealing specifically in a case where with two different avodas, the thought processes took place over two avodas. Tabed the chashuv b'zrika, and the reason it's no good because he had the improper thought regarding the throwing of the blood. The ein machsheves. Now, Daddy, we get to what you were saying. The ein machsheves oichlin b'zrika. We're on 68.3 because after shechita on the next three avodas, which is accepting the blood, carrying the blood, and sprinkling the blood, if then you had a thought for those who cannot eat on the korban, then it doesn't mean anything. Because the problem that happens if I have a thought for somebody who cannot eat is only at the time of the slaughtering, because it all ties back to being registered on the korban. But with regard to one avodah, combined b'shchita, like at the time of slaughtering, the mahanya be'machsheves oichlin, with the improper attention regarding those who eat is significant and possible, because anybody who cannot eat, whether they're not well, or they're tamei, or they're uncircumcised, or they weren't registered, right? Because it all tied, they're all considered not registered. That's at the time of slaughtering. Here it's possible. Hakaimalon mixes oichlin lo possible. That can't be true, because the principle is, as long as part of the group could eat, they are registered, they're healthy, they're not tamei, they're circumcised, they could eat on the korban, and he had them in mind as well. It's not possible, it does not invalidate. We're now on Samach Amud Beis, 60b1. Says the Gemara, Elalab, what are we talking about? Ba'avoda achas. We must be talking about by one avodah during the shechita. He had in mind both, side this and side that, right? Need the Sefer Ba'avoida Achas, Reishanami Ba'avoida Achas, and the Gemara says the same thing. Midi Aryeh, who says? Halkanisa, Sefer Ba'avoida Achas, Reisha, our Mishnah, Oy Ba'avoida Achas, Mishneh Avoidis. Bottom line is, I have no clarity. So I still don't know is our Mishnah Rabbi Yosi or our Meir. I still don't know. Okay? And so the Gemara leaves it alone. We're not sure who's the Tana of our Mishnah. Is it Rabbi Yosi that says we look at the totality of what the guy says? Or Amei who says only Taitis Lashon Rishon and only goes by the first words? Since we don't know, we're leaving it alone. We say, okay, there is an author to our Mishnah. I don't know who it is. As my father says, you don't die from a klotz kasha. Let's go further.
Even for a good kasha.
Even for a good kasha, but you never said that, Daddy. You're right. At those days, you didn't acknowledge the good kashas. This is an interesting case. This is the case where, for some strange reason, in Kislev, in Chanukah time, you decided to put aside a sheep for your Pesach that you have to bring on the 14th of Nisan 3 months later. And then you go ahead and you bring it in middle of Adar. For some strange reason, you decide to bring your Korban Pesach, either for the name of a Pesach or the name of a Shlomim. The answer is, since a Pesach really is a Shlomim, the rest of the year, just on the 14th, on Erev Pesach, it's specifically for Korban Pesach. But the rest of the year, the truth is, there's no difference between it and any Shlomim. The truth is, we're going to let you get away with it and bring it for a Shlomim. You won't get atonement, but you certainly can go ahead and bring it. But anyways, here's the question. A Pesach that for some strange reason you put aside and you brought it the rest of the year. You brought it in the thing with Shmoi for its name, Ushaloi l'Shmoi, and not for a Pesach and a Shlomim. And the Pesach is meaningless because it's not Erev Pesach. So now, what's the din? Does the intention for not its own sake, for the sake of a Shlomim come, and remove it, erase its thought process for a Pesach because today is not Erev Pesach, and make it good and say, listen, for some strange reason, this guy loves Pesach. He decided to put aside a korban for Pesach in the middle of the year and shecht it in the middle of the year for the sake of a Pesach and a Shlomim. It's not really a Pesach. It's not the time for Pesach. Let the thought processing for a Shlomim go ahead and erase everything that has to do with Pesach and make it good for Shlomim the rest of the year. He also, Rabdimi, when Rabdimi arrived in Babel from Eretz Yisrael, Omar, he said, Armina l'shmat kamed Rabbi Yirmiyah. I said the following in the presence of Rabbi Yirmiyah, since intention for its own sake makes the Pesach valid on Erev, so that means on Erev Pesach you shecht it for the shame of a Pesach, and not for its own sake the rest of the year, makes it good for a Shlomim. So you put aside a korban for a Pesach, but you actually shecht it in middle of the year for the sake of a Shlomim. It's okay, it's a Shlomim. Therefore, what do you call it? Just like for its own sake, makes the Pesach valid during its own time. The fact that you set it aside 6 months early is meaningless as long as on Erev Pesach you have the right thought process. And does not remove it, not for its own sake. That means on the 14th of Nisan, the Pesach was slaughtered Shaloi Lishma and Lishma. It was slaughtered not for its own sake, for the sake of a Shlomim and for the sake of a Pesach. We only look at the Lishma thing. According to this Tana, we only look at what it's supposed to be. So if on the 14th of Pesach he does it Shaloi Lishma, not for its own sake, and for its own sake, we only look at the forsake. Right? So then too, an intention not for its own sake, will render it valid not during its time, Ein moitzi b'dei l'shmai u'pasul. Does not remove the other side, the l'shmai part, and therefore it's pasul. In other words, he's saying the rest of the year, if I put aside a carbon for Pesach, I put aside an animal for a Pesach, and then I shecht it in the middle of the year for the sake of a Pesach and the sake of a Shlomim, we say no, the sake of a Pesach blows it, since it's not Erev Pesach, it's in the middle of Adar, right? And therefore it's no good. Why? Because on Erev Pesach, if I shecht it for the, which is the right time, I shecht it, I slaughter it for the sake of a Pesach and the sake of a Shlomim, we ignore the sake of a Shlomim and we leave the thing for a Pesach. So you see, we're always going ahead and taking out for its, not for its own sake. So in one case, on Erev Pesach, it would make it a kosher animal, a kosher slaughtering, for the sake of a Pesach. The rest of the year, it would make it a puzzle, not because it's not the day for Pesach, and the Shaloi Lishma, but since it was set aside for a Pesach, it's Shaloi Lishma as a Shlomim, and that would be no good. Va'amrli, and Rabbi Yomi said to me, Roy, it's not a comparison. If you say the intention is not for its own sake, because that's an invalidation by all sacrifices. By all sacrifices, the Masechtas Zavachim starts off right away. If you do it shaloi l'shma, not for its own sake, it's no good. Period. Toima b'lishma, you're going to tell me when you do something for its own sake, which is not an invalidating intention except for the Pesach alone when you do it the rest of the year, right? When you set aside a Pesach the rest of the year and you do it for the sake of the Pesach, not on the 14th of Nisan, it passes it the rest of the year. But every other zebach, every other sacrifice, if you sacrifice it for its proper intention, of course it's good. So there's no comparison. It doesn't equate. So now we're up to 60B2, and this is where we're stopping when we get to the bottom here. So says the Gemara, my habalo. So what was the end result of all this? Amaravo Pesach Pesach. Sheshachtu b'shayim ha'isashana, that's slaughtered the rest of the year. L'shmai, for its own sake, u'shaloi l'shmai kosher, is kosher. Because we ignore the Pesach side of it and we say the Shlomim part is okay. The whole stamai l'shmai koi, because without it being specified, a Pesach stands to be offered for its own sake. For a Pesach. That means if you bring it on Erev Pesach, even if you don't say this is for a Pesach, the assumption is it's for a Pesach. And even when you slaughter it not for its own sake, kosher, it's kosher. Takes it out of its lishma. And therefore, the rest of the year, it's not a Pesach because it only is a Pesach on the 14th of Pesach. So the rest of the year, if I do it Shaloi Lishmai, we're going to ignore the Lishmai thing, and it's going to be a good Shlom. Amalei Rabada Baraba Laraba Rabada Baraba says to Rabba, no way. Dilma Shani Hachad, there's a difference. Where he states specifically, clearly, that he intends to slaughter it for its own sake, where he does not say it, and it's only assumed. It's a presumption. Because in the case of a Pesach, when somebody offers the Pesach, like we said before, for those who could eat it, and for those who could not eat it, we say it is, according to this, we say it's good, right? It's good, because at least you brought it for some of the people who are registered and could eat it. But if you slaughter it only for those who cannot eat it, because they're not well, or because they're not circumcised, or because they're tamei, or because they're not registered, and you shecht it, the carbon is no good. Period, it's no good. Why should it be no good? Without saying a Pesach stands to be offered for those who could eat it. Why should you then say an additional intention for those who can't eat it, should passel it? We should view the Pesach as if it was slaughtered for both those who could eat it and those who can't eat it. Because even though you clearly was said, or you clearly had the intention to slaughter it for those who can't eat it, but you can also argue, stam, there's also a basic presumption that you're slaughtering it for those who couldn't eat it. So therefore, it should be a case of those who could eat it and those who can't eat it. So you ignore those who can't eat it, and you let it be good for those who could eat it. We have to say where you state it explicitly, where you do not state it explicitly. Where you state explicitly, I am slaughtering it for these guys who are not circumcised, for these guys who are tomei, then it's no good. But if you slaughter it without saying a word, then we could assume you can have both intentions. You intended for those who cannot eat it, which is no good, but also there's a presumption that you're slaughtering it to those who could also eat it, and therefore it's good. Hey, in our case too, Shani Amalei said, how does that approve? Says Rabbi. In the case of intention for the sake of the offering, where you have the proper intention, as long as he does not undermine the Pesach with another intention during the slaughter, without being set, even if he doesn't specify, we go ahead and say he's doing it for its own sake. Of course, the assumption, the chazaka is that he's doing it correctly. The intent, the chazaka, the presumption is he does it correctly. In the case where he slaughters it for those who cannot eat it, in the case of those who cannot eat it, in case of somebody that's uncircumcised, right, the stam, and without specifying, you want to say that it's also going on those who could eat it. Perhaps those people who registered on the carbon withdrew from the carbon, because as long as you didn't slaughter the Pesach, people can register and people can remove themselves from the registry. In other words, people can go ahead and say, oh, I want to be on Yitzchak, your carbon. Then Jerry comes along, and Jerry's more popular than me. And they go, forget you, Yitzchak. We're going to register with Jerry, right? You can keep doing that all day long until the time of the slaughtering. Perhaps those who registered who are allowed to eat, who are circumcised, and who do not and are not tomei, they went switch. They went off your carbon, right? Vahani achrini, and these who came, mini alel, and others came who can't eat, and they registered on it. They went ahead and registered. Titznan, nimninu moishven es yedeya mimenu achi yoshchet. You can register or withdraw from it as many times as you want until you slaughter it. It's a moving target. It's a moving target. You cannot say that this is presumption. This is a rule now. A chazaka, a presumption, can only be where there is stability. Where there isn't stability, you cannot argue chazaka or presumptive state. So, in a normal election, you could presume there's a winner and a loser, and that Biden will be the legitimate president. But in this case, where there's so many different moving parts, right, there's no presumption. So he's coming president under a cloud. Exactly, essentially over here. When do I say that there's a presumption, a chazaka, that everything was slaughtered for the right intentions, or even for the wrong intentions, but also for the right intention, meaning for those who can't eat, but it was also slaughtered with a presumption that it will go for those who could eat. That's if there's stability. But since people could come off and on the registry, right, until the moment of slaughtering, it's a moving target. If it's a moving target, there's no presumption. Therefore, there's no presumption. And the only thing that we do know is that he's slaughtering it for those who can't eat because they're not circumcised. That's what we have to rely on, and then it's possible because I have no presumption to assume that there are anybody around that could eat because it's a moving target. Very good. This is where we're up to. We're up to the bottom. We're actually on top of 60B3. We're on the bottom of 60B3.